absolute despair, a millionaire walks the streets with $100 in hand, searching for an impossible solution. He finds a starving girl begging on the sidewalk and, with no other choice, makes a desperate proposal. "Please, I need you to pretend to be my daughter for a few hours." The child, trembling with fear but driven by hunger, hesitantly agrees. But when she learns the reason, she is shocked. The aroma of single-origin Colombian coffee, freshly ground and served in a fine porcelain cup, would normally have been the highlight of Arthur's morning. But today, the expensive scent mingled with the sour tang of panic rising in his throat. He was standing in his 30th floor office, his sweaty palms pressed against the cool, floor-to-ceiling glass. New York City sprawled below him, a pulsating metropolis of opportunity and commerce. A kingdom he felt he'd conquered tooth and nail. But that entire empire, the immense fortune built on daring stock market investments and an almost inhuman dedication, felt like it was about to crumble to dust because of a single, stupid, harmless lie. A lie that was now growing like a shadow, ready to swallow everything. "A daughter," he whispered to his pale reflection in the glass. "I had to say I had a daughter." The memory ambushed him with the clarity of a recent nightmare. A few weeks ago, at a gala dinner, he was seated next to Mr. Blackwood, the company's global CEO. A man with silver hair and a penetrating gaze who valued, above all else, the image of stability. All the other executives were talking about their children, about school plays and family vacations. Feeling like a fish out of water, Arthur, in an impulse to connect, had invented one. "My little Sophia," he'd said with a forced smile, "just started ballet. It's the most adorable thing." At that moment, the lie had seemed like a small social investment, a way to humanize himself in his boss's eyes. But the email that had arrived that morning had turned his little bluff into a disaster of epic proportions. The firm was holding a special ceremony to announce the new senior partners. It was the chance of a lifetime, the pinnacle of his career, and the email ended with a sentence that made his heart stop. "We are eager to celebrate this milestone with you and your loving families. The presence of spouses and children is essential to commemorate this moment of unity." His first call had been to Isabella, his girlfriend. Her reaction was like a bucket of ice water. "You what?" she'd shrieked down the line, her usually silky voice now as sharp as broken glass. "You said you had a daughter. Arthur, have you lost your mind? I'm not participating in this farce. If they find out, my reputation will be toast too. Handle it, or you can forget about me." The click of the phone ending the call echoed in his office like a verdict. His plan B was just as disastrous. He spent the next 2 hours calling every child acting agency in the city. The answer was always the same. It was impossible to get a child actor with the necessary background checks and preparation for a high-security corporate event on such short notice. "We'd need weeks, sir, not days." Now, time was running out. The ceremony was in less than a week. He stared down at the streets below, at the people scurrying like ants, each with their own problems that surely seemed smaller than the abyss opening up beneath his feet. He had money, a fortune many envied, with assets spread from stocks to cryptocurrency. But what good was all that capital if he couldn't buy the one thing he desperately needed, a fake daughter? Desperation was a tight knot in his chest. Every door had closed. Every solution had evaporated. Alone in his glass tower, the multimillionaire Arthur felt like the poorest, most powerless man in the world, looking out at the city he once felt was his. Now just a reminder of everything he was about to lose. His eyes, once focused on the horizon of skyscrapers, now roamed aimlessly over the sidewalk in front of his building, where a small figure was moving slowly. But he barely registered the image, lost in his labyrinth of panic. There was no way out, or was there? That small figure on the sidewalk became the single point of focus in his collapsing universe. Desperation has a peculiar way of sharpening the mind. of opening paths that reason would normally block. Arthur didn't think, he just acted. He strode across his luxurious office, ignored his secretary's confused glance, and stabbed the button for his private elevator with an urgency he hadn't felt since closing his first major deal years ago. The ride to the ground floor felt like an eternity, each descending floor a step down toward a decision he knew was insane. When the brushed steel doors opened, the humid, noisy city air hit him like a slap, a brutal contrast to the climate-controlled silence of his empire. He saw her up close now. She was a girl, maybe 7 or 8, sitting on a concrete step, huddled inside a ragged coat that was far too big for her. Her hair, a brown that might have been pretty if it were clean, was tangled and fell over a face smudged with grime. But it was her eyes that stopped him. They were large, brown, and held a watchfulness that didn't belong to a child. They observed every person who passed, not with the naive hope of childhood, but with the quick, weary assessment of someone who had learned to separate threats from opportunities. Arthur felt his heart hammer against his ribs. He, a man accustomed to negotiating multi-million-dollar deals, felt like a complete amateur. He approached slowly, the soles of his Italian leather shoes making an unnervingly loud sound on the dirty sidewalk. The girl saw him coming, and her body tensed, ready to bolt. "Hello," he said, his voice coming out hoarser than he intended. I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't answer, just sized him up, her eyes locked on his, suspicious. He cleared his throat, feeling ridiculous. "I need help," he said, the words tumbling out. "I need a favor. A huge favor." The girl remained silent, but one thin eyebrow arched, a sign that she was listening. "I need you to pretend to be my daughter, just for a few hours." The sentence hung in the air between them, absurd and awful. Arthur saw a range of emotions cross the girl's face, surprise, confusion, and finally a cynical hardening that shocked him. "Why?" she asked, her voice low and a little raspy, as if it weren't used often. "It's complicated." "It's for my job," he answered, knowing how weak it sounded. He pulled his wallet from his pocket, the soft leather an object from another world in this setting. He took out a $100 bill. I'll pay you this." The girl's eyes locked on the money, and for an instant he saw the hungry child behind the survivor's facade. She swallowed hard, the small movement visible in her thin neck. But when she looked back at him, the hardness had returned. "2 things," she said with a firmness that disarmed him. "First, you promise you won't hurt me, no one will touch me." Arthur was speechless. Her condition revealed a world of pain he could barely imagine. "I promise," he whispered, his throat tight. "I swear." "Second," she continued, holding out a small, grimy hand, "payment is up front." He looked at her hand, then at her serious, determined face. In that moment, he didn't just see a solution to his desperate problem. He saw a strength, a resilience his vast fortune could never buy. Slowly, he placed the $100 bill in her palm. Her fingers closed around the money with surprising speed. She stood up, still watching him with those wary eyes. The deal was sealed, a bizarre pact made on a New York City sidewalk, binding a panicked multimillionaire and a homeless girl. He had gotten what he wanted. But as he looked at the small, fragile figure before him, a chill ran down his spine. He had no idea what kind of abyss he had just stepped into. The walk back into the skyscraper was an exercise in silent tension. Arthur kept a calculated distance from the girl, as if escorting a fragile and dangerous secret. Every step they took together on the polished marble of the lobby was a silent scream against the established order of the place. The receptionist, an impeccable woman named Clara, looked up from her screen and her professional smile froze. Her gaze traveled from Arthur's expensive shoes to the girl's torn sneakers, and a silent, shocked question hung in the air. Arthur just gave a curt, authoritative nod and guided her into the private elevator before any questions could be formed. Inside the glass and metal cab, the silence was even heavier. The girl, whose name he still didn't know, kept to the opposite corner. Her body tense, her eyes fixed on the numbers ascending on the digital panel. She still clutched the $100 bill in her hand, the paper crumpled in a tight fist, as if it were her only anchor in the world. Arthur, for his part, felt like a stranger in his own sanctuary. He, who managed a portfolio worth hundreds of millions and conducted complex business with glacial calm, had no idea what to say to a 7-year-old child. "So, what's your name?" he ventured, the question sounding hollow and formal. She glanced at him for a moment before answering, "Lena." Just that. When the doors opened directly into his penthouse apartment, a vast space of panoramic windows, minimalist designer furniture, and an aseptic cleanliness, Lena stopped at the threshold. Her large eyes scanned the place with an unreadable expression. It wasn't awe, but a kind of cautious assessment, like a wild animal entering an unknown territory. "You can come in," Arthur said, feeling like an inept host. "Are you hungry? There's food in the kitchen." The mention of food broke her stillness. He led her to the kitchen, an environment of stainless steel and white cabinets, and opened the refrigerator. The cold light revealed an abundance that suddenly felt obscene to him. Fresh fruit, yogurts, juices, cheeses. Lena just stared, paralyzed by the choice. Arthur took out a plate and put a sandwich, an apple, and a glass of juice on it. He watched her eat at the enormous dining table in silence. She ate quickly, but not desperately, her eyes always alert. When she finished, he saw her discreetly wrap a leftover piece of bread in a napkin and try to slip it into her coat pocket. The gesture hit him with unexpected force, a small revelation of the constant precarity she lived in. "I need to know a few things for our arrangement," he began, trying to keep a businesslike tone. "Your age, where you're from, things like that." Lena stared at him, chewing the last bite of her apple. "I'm 7. I'm not from anywhere." "Everyone's from somewhere, Lena. Where are your parents?" A shadow passed over her eyes. "Don't have any." Her voice was a whisper. "I ran away." "Ran away? From where?" She hesitated, her eyes darting to the door as if calculating an escape route. "From the system. A group home." Arthur felt a knot form in his stomach. "Why did you run away?" Lena shrugged, a gesture that seemed to carry the weight of the world. "In there, you're just a number. No one cares if you eat or if you're cold. It was like being invisible. At least on the street I know I'm alone for a reason." Her words, spoken with brutal simplicity, dismantled the business framework he was trying to impose on the situation. This wasn't a deal anymore. It was something much deeper and more complicated. He was dealing with a wounded child who had fled a negligent system for the brutality of the streets. The realization of what she must have endured hit him, awakening a strange, protective feeling he didn't recognize. In that moment, his problem with the partnership seemed small, almost insignificant. He was looking at a real problem, a real life. And as he processed this new, heavy reality, his phone buzzed on the granite countertop. It was Marcus, his chief rival at the firm. Arthur answered, his heart suddenly racing. "Arthur, my dear fellow!" Marcus's voice was falsely cheerful. "Rumors are flying around here. I hear you have an adorable daughter you've been hiding from all of us. What a pleasant surprise." Marcus's voice, oily and dripping with malicious curiosity, made Arthur's blood run cold. He moved away from the table, turning his back to Lena, as if to shield the fragile charade from his rival's audible scrutiny. "Marcus," he said, forcing a casual tone, "always interested in other people's lives, aren't you?" "Only in the lives of my future partners," Marcus shot back, the taunt unmistakable. It's so sudden, you see. You, the eternal bachelor focused only on your investments and cash flow, suddenly emerge as a family man. It's quite a story. Some of us are even curious to know more about the child's mother." Every word was a small jab, a probe, searching for weakness. Arthur knew Marcus wasn't just curious, he was predatory. Any sign of inconsistency would be exploited, magnified, and used against him. "My personal life isn't one of your assets, Marcus," Arthur said, his voice harder than he intended. "But yes, I have a daughter, Sophia, and she's the most important thing in the world to me." The lie came out with a facility that scared him. "Sophia, what a lovely name," Marcus said, drawing out the syllable. "I can't wait to meet her at the ceremony. By the way, a friend of mine, a private investigator, mentioned there's a distinct lack of records for a Sophia connected to you. Birth certificates, school enrollments. You know how it is. This city's bureaucracy is a nightmare." The veiled threat hung in the air. It wasn't just a rumor, it was an investigation. Marcus was digging. Arthur felt sweat break out on the back of his neck. "We're sorting out the paperwork." It was a complicated process. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm in the middle of an important moment with her." He hung up before Marcus could reply, his heart pounding. He turned to find Lena's eyes fixed on him. She had heard everything. The expression on her face was a frightening neutrality, the mask of someone who had learned not to show emotion to survive. But he saw the slight tightening of her jaw, the way her fingers gripped the edge of the table. "Your name is Sophia now," he said, his voice low and tense. "We need to practice. We need to build a story." The next few days became an intensive and surreal training camp. He took her to an expensive department store, where the saleswomen looked at them with a mixture of curiosity and thinly veiled contempt. He bought dresses, shoes, hair ribbons, everything he imagined a multimillionaire's daughter would wear. Lena was silent through the entire process, allowing herself to be dressed like a doll, but her eyes never lost their spark of distrust. She looked like a little prisoner in designer clothes. He taught her the story he had invented. A mother who traveled extensively for work, a childhood spent in European boarding schools, the reason no one had met her before. She absorbed it all with a photographic memory, repeating the details with robotic precision. But there was no warmth, no life in her words. The biggest obstacle, he discovered, wasn't her memory, but her trust. She was always on alert, always ready to flee. One night, he woke to a noise in the living room. He went out to find her by the front door. Her old coat pulled on over the silk pajamas he'd bought her, her sneakers in her hand, ready to disappear into the night. He didn't shout. He just stood there, his heart aching in his chest. "Where are you going, Lena?" she started, dropping one sneaker to the floor with a soft thud. "I can't do this," she whispered, her voice trembling for the first time. "It's a lie, all of it. And when people find out your lies, they hurt you. They always hurt you." The fear in her voice was so palpable, so genuine, that it broke something inside him. The charade, the partnership, it all seemed to fade away, leaving only the image of this terrified child, caught between the brutality she knew and the falsehood he was offering. He approached slowly, kneeling to be at her eye level. "I know it's a lie," he said softly, "but I promised I wouldn't hurt you. And I won't." "No one is going to hurt you while you're with me." She stared at him, her large, wet eyes searching his face for any sign of deceit. She wanted to believe him. He could see it, but the world had already betrayed her too many times, and as he tried desperately to convey some shred of sincerity, his phone rang again. This time, it was Mr. Blackwood's private number. Arthur felt a chill run down his spine. Had Marcus's digging already reached the top? The discreet chime of Mr. Blackwood's ringtone seemed to pierce the tense silence of the apartment. Arthur looked at the phone in his hand, then at Lena, who was still huddled by the door, her face a mask of uncertainty. This call could be the ruin of everything. It could be the one that exposed his fraud, destroyed his career, and worse, confirmed the child's every fear about adults who lie and hurt. For a moment, he considered not answering, letting the call drop and buying a few precious moments of ignorance. But he knew that would only make things worse, raising even more suspicion. With a deep sigh, he answered, "Arthur, Mr. Blackwood's voice was deep and sounded closer than expected. "Sorry to call at this hour. I imagine you're busy with little Sophia." Arthur's heart leaped. He didn't sound accusatory. On the contrary, there was an almost warm tone. "Mr. Blackwood, no problem at all. We were just, getting ready for bed." He glanced at Lena, who was watching every micro-expression on his face. "Excellent, excellent. Family first, I always say. Listen, the reason for my call is a bit informal. My wife, Eleanor, heard about your girl and was absolutely charmed by the idea of you being a father. She insists we should get together before the formal ceremony, something more relaxed. How about lunch at the club on Saturday, just the four of us? Eleanor, myself, you, and little Sophia. She's so eager to meet the newest addition to our corporate family." The air seemed to be sucked out of Arthur's lungs. A lunch. Not a controlled, scripted event, but an intimate gathering with questions, conversation, and close observation. It was a much harder test, a trap disguised as a courtesy. The CEO's wife, Eleanor, was known for her shrewdness and her sharp eye for detail. She would see through the farce in minutes. "Of course, Mr. Blackwood, that would be an honor," he managed to say, his voice sounding strangely distant to his own ears. "Wonderful. Saturday at noon, then. Until then, Arthur." The call ended. The silence that followed was deafening. Arthur looked at Lena. Her escape plan seemed to have been forgotten, replaced by the understanding that the situation had just become infinitely more complicated. "We have a bigger problem now," he said, his voice low. Lena didn't reply, but she slowly moved back to the center of the room, leaving her coat and sneakers behind. She sat on the couch, her feet barely touching the floor, and watched him with a seriousness that made him feel as if he were being judged. The next 2 days were a race against time. He tried to teach Lena not just facts, but mannerisms, how to use the silverware, how to answer questions about hobbies she never had, how to smile in a way that didn't look forced. Every lesson was a painful reminder of the chasm between her world and the one he was trying to create. During a lunch rehearsal, she held her fork in a tight fist, as if holding a weapon. When he tried to correct her posture, she flinched, the instinct for self-preservation stronger than any instruction. On Friday night, the eve of the lunch, the tension was palpable. Arthur was exhausted, not from work, but from the emotional toll of maintaining this charade. He found Lena in the guest room, sitting on the edge of the luxurious bed, staring at a small music box he had bought for her as a prop. It was silver, with a ballerina that spun to a delicate tune. She didn't hear him come in. He watched her in silence for a moment. She wasn't playing with the box. She was staring at her own distorted reflection in the polished silver lid, her finger tracing the image of her face as if it belonged to a stranger. There was a sorrow so profound in the gesture that Arthur's heart ached. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. Lena snapped the box shut, the music cutting off abruptly. "I can't. I'm not this girl. I'm not Sophia." She looked up at him, her eyes full of an anguish that went beyond fear. "Tomorrow, they're going to know. They'll look at me and they'll know I don't belong here, that I'm not your daughter." He sat beside her on the bed, keeping a respectful distance. "We'll just try our best. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. It won't be your fault." "It's not about fault," she said, her voice a whisper. "It's just, for a second, I almost believed it, that I could be someone who wears nice dresses and has a dad. It was just for a second, but it felt nice." She looked down at her hands. "And when they find out, that feeling will be gone, and it will hurt more than before." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He wasn't just risking his career. He was playing with the fragile hopes of a child who had already lost everything. And in that moment of vulnerability, as she looked at the music box as if it were the only real thing in a world of lies, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. A thin, plain leather cord around her neck, tucked under the collar of her pajamas. On it hung a tiny metal locket, tarnished and dull. He'd never seen her take it off, not even to shower. Curious, he reached for it. "What's that?" Lena flinched instinctively as Arthur's hand drew near, a quick, defensive motion that spoke of years of self-protection. She brought her own hand to her chest, covering the small locket as if shielding her heart. Her eyes, which moments before had been clouded with sorrow, now glinted with a spark of defiance. Seeing her reaction, Arthur immediately pulled his hand back, raising his palms in a gesture of peace. "Sorry," he said, his voice gentle. "I didn't mean to startle you. I'd never noticed it before." She watched him for a long moment, suspicion warring with vulnerability in her face. Slowly, as if making a difficult decision, she relaxed her hand, revealing the leather cord. The locket was small, oval, and made of a cheap metal, perhaps pewter or brass, now darkened with time and constant wear. It had no shine, no jewels, yet she held it as if it were the greatest of riches, a treasure of incalculable worth. "It was my mom's," she whispered, her voice so low he had to lean in to hear. It was the first time she had mentioned her mother voluntarily. Until then, her parents were just a void, a "don't have any" that ended any conversation. Arthur felt he was treading on sacred ground. "It's very beautiful," he said, the phrase sounding inadequate for the worn object, but it was the only thing he could think of. "It's not supposed to be beautiful," she corrected him with childlike seriousness. "It's to remember." She worked the tiny clasp open with surprisingly nimble fingers. Inside, there was no space for photographs. Instead, on one side was an engraved date, May 15th. On the other, a single word, sunflower. "Sunflower?" Arthur asked, confused, a ghost of a smile. The first he had ever seen touched Lena's lips. "She called me that, said I always turned toward the light, no matter how dark it was." The memory seemed to warm her from the inside, but the light in her eyes faded as quickly as it appeared. "She gave me this before she left." The phrase, "she left," was a child's euphemism for something Arthur suspected was far more permanent and painful. He didn't press. This small glimpse into her past was a fragile gift, a bridge of trust being hesitantly built over the chasm between them. He felt a pang of something that resembled envy. That worthless locket held more genuine history and love than anything in his luxurious, empty apartment. His own fortune seemed sterile by comparison. "She must have loved you very much," Arthur said, and the words came out with a sincerity that surprised him. Lena closed the locket and tucked it back under her pajama collar. "I don't know. People who love you don't leave." The statement was delivered without self-pity, just a cold observation, the cruel logic of a child forced to grow up too fast. The moment of connection was broken. The door to her past closed again. They sat in silence for a while, the absent melody of the music box hanging in the air. The conversation about the locket, however, seemed to have shifted something in her. When Arthur finally stood to leave, wishing her good night, she called out to him. "Arthur," he turned. "Tomorrow, at the lunch. I'll try," she said. "I'll really try. At least they can't take this away from me." She touched the locket hidden under her shirt, an almost unconscious gesture. The next day, when he saw her in the blue dress they had chosen, her hair brushed and tied back with a ribbon, she looked like a different person. But he knew that beneath the facade of Sophia was Lena, the girl who clung to a metal locket as her only inheritance. And for the first time, he wasn't just worried about being caught. He was worried about her, worried about how this experience would affect her, how the lie he had created to save his assets might end up costing her something far more precious. As they walked into the exclusive club, a sanctuary of wealth and power, Arthur felt every eye turn toward them. He put a protective hand on Lena's shoulder. She was stiff, but her chin was held high. They spotted Mr. Blackwood and his wife, Eleanor, at a table by the window. Eleanor Blackwood was exactly as he'd feared, elegant, with a warm smile, but eyes that missed nothing. The lunch started well. Lena was surprisingly calm, answering questions with the story they had rehearsed. But then, Eleanor, while pouring Lena some water, noticed the leather cord around her neck. "Oh, what an interesting necklace." "And dear," she said with a gentle smile, "may I see?" Lena's body went rigid. Arthur felt panic rise. This was a detail they hadn't rehearsed, a piece of Lena's real world invading Sophia's fiction. Slowly, Lena pulled the locket out from under her dress. Eleanor took it gently. "How antique. Does it have a special meaning?" "It was my mom's," Lena said, her voice steady. Eleanor opened the clasp. Her eyes scanned the inside. Arthur held his breath. Eleanor's smile faltered for a fraction of a second as she read the inscription. Her gaze lifted from the locket and met Arthur's. And in her eyes was a shocking new expression, a mixture of astonishment and something that looked like recognition. Time seemed to slow down. The distant clinking of silverware and the murmur of conversations in the club's dining hall faded away, leaving only the tense silence around their table. Eleanor Blackwood's eyes remained locked on Arthur's, a terrifying, silent bridge of communication. That look didn't hold the accusation he had expected, but something far more complex and destabilizing. A recognition that cut through him like a blade of ice. She knew something, but what? How could that tarnished locket, an artifact from Lena's forgotten life, mean anything to her? Mr. Blackwood, oblivious to the subterranean current of tension, chuckled. "Well, it seems little Sophia has a treasure. Good to keep memories alive, isn't it?" Eleanor didn't respond to her husband. Slowly, as if handling a fragile relic, she closed the locket and handed it back to Lena, her fingers brushing the girl's for an instant. The smile she offered Lena was different now, tinged with a melancholy that hadn't been there before. "You take good care of that, dear. It's very, very precious." She then turned to Arthur, the smile vanishing to be replaced by a serious expression. "Arthur, your work on the European Investment Fund has been remarkable. Your reports on the Frankfurt Stock Exchange are always impeccable." The subject changed so abruptly, it left him dizzy. He mumbled a thank you, his mind spinning, trying to decipher the enigma in her gaze. The rest of the lunch passed in a blur. Arthur and Lena barely touched their food, answering in monosyllables, while Eleanor steered the conversation with a forced grace, carefully avoiding any other personal topics. In the car on the way home, the silence was a wall between them. Lena was quiet in the back seat, her hand never straying from her neck, as if to make sure her only treasure was still there. Arthur drove mechanically, the scene in the restaurant replaying in his mind. Eleanor's gaze, the recognition, it made no sense. As soon as they got to the apartment, he turned to Lena. "The locket," he said, his voice urgent. "Your mother, what was her name?" Lena stared at him, suspicion returning. "Why? You never asked before." "It's important, Lena. Please." She hesitated, biting her lower lip. "Catherine." Arthur repeated the name in his mind. Catherine. It meant nothing to him. He didn't know any Catherines. He sifted through his memories, the countless women who had passed briefly through his life. Casual encounters at corporate events, shallow relationships built on convenience and status. No Catherine stood out. Eleanor's connection had to be a coincidence, his imagination playing tricks on him, but the doubt gnawed at him. He needed to know more. That night, after Lena was asleep, he did something he never thought he would. He used his resources, his immense fortune, not for an investment or to acquire a new asset, but to dig into the past. He hired the best private investigator in the city, the same kind of professional Marcus was likely using against him. The instruction was simple and chilling. Find out everything you can about a woman named Catherine, who had a 7-year-old daughter named Lena and who may have recently died in the city, and find out if there was any connection, however tenuous, to Eleanor Blackwood. The wait was torturous. For 3 days, he lived in a state of paralyzing anxiety, keeping up the charade for Lena, taking her to parks and museums to maintain appearances, but his mind was elsewhere. Finally, on Wednesday evening, an encrypted email arrived. It was from the investigator. The file was password protected and contained a single document. With trembling hands, Arthur typed in the password and opened the file. It was a scanned copy of a birth certificate. The child's name, Lena Rose Miller. Date of birth, May 15th. The same date engraved in the locket. Place of birth, St. Mary's Hospital. Mother's name, Catherine Miller. His heart pounded as his eyes moved down to the next line, the one he both dreaded and longed to see. The space for the father's name was filled in, and as he read the name printed there in cold, undeniable block letters, Arthur's world fell apart. The air left his lungs in a hiss, the luxury penthouse seeming to spin around him. The lie he had built, the farce he had orchestrated to save his career, had suddenly transformed into a truth so monstrous and inescapable it left him breathless. The father's name was Arthur Vance. His name. The name on the birth certificate seemed to float on the screen, a set of letters he knew intimately. Yet in this context, it felt alien and damning. Arthur Vance. He read it again and again, as if repetition could alter the reality printed in digital ink. A wave of nausea hit him, followed by a chill that spread through his limbs, an ice that not even his apartment's state-of-the-art heating system could combat. The pieces of his memory's puzzle, fragments he had buried under layers of ambition and willful denial, began to surface painfully. Catherine Miller. The name now echoed with a ghostly clarity. She wasn't an executive or a socialite, she was an artist. A painter he'd met at a gallery in Soho nearly 8 years ago. He remembered her smile, her paint-stained hands, the way she spoke about color and light, with a passion he reserved for stock charts and profit reports. It had been a brief, intense, and, to him, insignificant relationship. An interlude in his corporate climb. He remembered the day she told him she was pregnant. The memory struck him with the force of a long-suppressed confession. He'd been in his old apartment, smaller but with the same coveted city view. Her words, "I'm pregnant, Arthur. We're having a baby," had felt like a threat to his meticulously planned future. A child didn't fit into his plans to build an empire, to amass a fortune. A child was a liability, not an asset. His reaction had been swift, cold, and calculated. He denied it. He said it couldn't be his, that she must be mistaken. He offered her money, a substantial sum to solve the problem. He remembered the look on her face, a mixture of shock, hurt, and finally, a wounded dignity that silenced him. She hadn't taken the money. She had just looked at him for a long time and then said, with devastating calm, "One day, Arthur, you'll realize the only wealth that matters can't be deposited in a bank." And then she was gone. And he, in an act of monumental cowardice, had let her go, erasing her from his life like a failed transaction from an accounting ledger. Now, the child he had rejected was sleeping in the next room, hired for $100 to pretend to be the daughter he never wanted. The irony was so brutal, so perfectly cruel, it was almost poetic. He was literally paying his own daughter to pretend to be his daughter. The charade was no longer a charade. It was fate mocking him, forcing him to confront the truth he had abandoned. He stood and walked to the guest room, the birth certificate burning in his mind. He opened the door with infinite care. Lena was asleep, curled up under the expensive comforter, her face relaxed in the innocence of slumber. For the first time, he didn't see her as a solution to a problem, or as a victim to be protected. He saw her. He saw the hints of Catherine in her chin, the curve of her eyebrow. He saw a flash of himself in the shape of her nose. She was his daughter, The blood in her veins was his blood. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over him. Shame, guilt, a regret so deep it was physical, an ache in his chest, and beneath it all, a new and terrifying feeling, love, a possessive, protective love emerging from the ruins of his denial. He, who had never loved anything but his net worth, felt his heart break for this small stranger who was his flesh and blood. He returned to the living room, his brain working at high speed. Eleanor Blackwood's connection, Catherine, Sunflower. He searched Catherine Miller's name online. The results were sparse. A few articles about local art shows from years ago, and then an obituary. Catherine Miller, deceased 3 months ago after a brief illness. The article mentioned her talent, her kindness, and her volunteer work at a local shelter. And at the end, a line. She is survived by her beloved 7-year-old daughter, Alina. But it was the name of the shelter that made his blood run cold again. The Sunflower Shelter for Women and Children. The name she gave her daughter, and in a related search, he found the name of the shelter's primary patron and founder, Eleanor Blackwood. The revelation hit him like lightning. Eleanor hadn't recognized him. She had recognized the locket. She recognized the story of Catherine, the woman she had likely helped at her shelter. She knew who Lena was, and seeing him with that girl, pretending to be her father, she must have jumped to the most monstrous conclusion that he had somehow kidnapped or coerced the orphaned daughter of the woman he'd abandoned to use her in his corporate scheme. The situation was infinitely worse than he had imagined. He wasn't just a liar. In the eyes of the CEO's wife, he was a monster. And now, with the promotion ceremony looming, he was trapped in a web of lies and truths that threatened not just his career, but the newly discovered chance to know his own daughter. The truth was crushing him. He spent the night awake, sitting in his leather armchair, the glow of the computer screen illuminating his pale face as the sleeping city stretched out below. The empire he had built, brick by brick of ruthless deals and calculated investments, now seemed like a hollow structure, about to collapse on the rotten foundations of his own choices. Every dollar in his account, every stock in his portfolio, felt tainted by the memory of the money he had offered Catherine to erase his daughter's existence. The wealth he had pursued so relentlessly had suddenly become a monument to his moral bankruptcy. As dawn broke, a new resolve began to form amidst the chaos of his guilt. He needed more than a document's confirmation. He needed biological, irrefutable certainty. Secretly, he collected a hairbrush Lena had used and sent it, along with a sample of his own DNA, to a private lab, paying an exorbitant fee for a rush result. The 48-hour wait was the longest of his life. Every minute was torture, a swing between terrifying hope and desperate denial. During that time, his interactions with Lena changed. He could no longer look at her without seeing Catherine's ghost, without feeling the weight of his own betrayal. He tried to act normal, but his gestures were clumsy, his voice freighted with an emotion he couldn't name. He watched her draw, a talent she had clearly inherited from her mother, and saw the same concentration, the same quiet passion. She drew sunflowers, entire fields of them, always turned toward a bright yellow sun. Each drawing was a knife in his heart. Lena, with the heightened sensitivity of one who has lived on constant alert, noticed the shift. He was no longer just the strange, desperate man who had hired her. There was something else in his gaze, a pain, an intensity that confused and frightened her. She grew quieter, more watchful, the fragile trust that had begun to sprout between them now threatened by this new, unreadable dynamic. When the email from the lab arrived, Arthur felt his hands go clammy. He clicked on the attached file and read the words that would change his life forever. Probability of paternity, 99.9999%. There was no more room for doubt, no room for denial. It was a fact, a biological, scientific, undeniable fact. Lena was his daughter. The hungry girl he had found on the street was the heir to his entire fortune. the only blood connection he had in the world, and he had treated her like a commodity. That night, guilt turned into action. He couldn't fix the past, couldn't bring Catherine back, but maybe, just maybe, he could start to build a future. He went to Lena's room. She was awake, sitting up in bed, reading one of the many books he had bought her. "Lena," he said, stopping in the doorway, "we need to talk." She put the book down, her eyes wary. He came in and sat on the edge of the bed, the same one where, days before, she had told him about the locket. "I haven't been completely honest with you," he began, his voice hoarse. "The story I invented about Sophia, it's not the only lie I've told." He took a deep breath, the air feeling heavy in his lungs. "I knew your mother, Lena, a long time ago." Lena's eyes widened. The book slid from her lap and hit the floor with a soft thud. "Her name was Catherine," Arthur continued, the confession pouring out in a painful rush. "She was wonderful. And I was young and stupid, focused only on money, on building a business. When she told me she was pregnant with you, I panicked. I pushed her away. I abandoned her." He couldn't look at her as he said the words. His eyes were fixed on his own hands, which were trembling in his lap. "I didn't know what happened to her, or to you, until now. I was a coward, Lena, and I am so sorry. More sorry than words can say." The silence in the room was absolute. He finally raised his eyes. Lena's face was a blank canvas, wiped clean of all emotion. She just stared at him, processing the enormity of what he had just revealed. He had abandoned her. The man who had rescued her from the street was the one who had, indirectly, put her there years before. The father she never had was the same man paying her to be a fake daughter. Slowly, she got out of bed. Her small fists were clenched at her sides. She took a step toward him, and for a moment he thought she would scream or cry, but she did neither. With terrifying calm, she looked directly into his eyes. The pain of a lifetime of abandonment focused in her gaze. "So," she said, her voice as cold as ice, "you're not my father. You're the man who didn't want to be my father." She turned, grabbed her old coat from the closet, and walked toward the door. "And now you want to use me again, for your job, for your money. I won't let you." She stopped at the door and looked back, tears finally shimmering in her eyes. "I'd rather go back to the street than spend another minute with you." Her words hit him harder than any accusation from Marcus or disdainful look from Isabella. "You're the man who didn't want to be my father." The line was a sentence, a verdict that summed up the entirety of his failure as a human being. He was paralyzed, sitting on the edge of the bed. As he watched her grab the coat, the symbol of her old life, of her hard-won independence. Every move she made was an indictment, a repudiation of him and everything his world represented. When she headed for the apartment door, a primal panic, something no stock market crash had ever evoked, jolted him into action. He shot to his feet, his body moving before his mind could process. "Lena, wait!" he yelled, his voice desperate. "Don't go! Please!" He reached her in the hallway, blocking the front door with his own body. She stopped, her face upturned, streaked with silent tears, but her eyes blazing with a righteous fury. "Get out of my way," she said, her voice low and trembling with rage. "I can't," he pleaded, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "I can't let you go back out there. I know I messed up. I know I'm the last person in the world who deserves your trust. But please, don't go back to the street." "Why?" She spat the word. "Because you still need me for your stupid ceremony? To pretend you're a good man in front of your rich friends? Is that why?" The accusation was true, and that made it all the more painful. Yes. A part of him, the old ambitious part, was still screaming about the promotion and appearances, but something much larger and more profound had taken over. The thought of her disappearing again into the vastness of the city, of being invisible, hungry, and in danger again, was unbearable. It was a physical pain, a twisting in his gut. "No," he said, and for the first time in years, he spoke with complete, unguarded vulnerability. "That's not why. It's because you're my daughter, and I can't lose you again. I already lost you once without even knowing what I was losing." Tears were streaming down his own face now, hot and unfamiliar. He, Arthur Vance, the master of emotional control, the stone-hearted multimillionaire, was crying in front of his 7-year-old daughter who hated him with every reason in the world. Lena stared at him, the fury in her eyes faltering for an instant, replaced by confusion. The sight of him, broken and pleading, didn't fit with the cold monster he had just confessed to being, but the betrayal was too deep a wound. "Your tears don't change what you did," she said, her voice a little less harsh but still firm. "You left me, and you left my mother. She got sick. She was alone, and you were here in this giant place, counting your money." Every word was a deserved blow. He didn't defend himself, he just nodded, accepting the weight of his guilt. "I know, and nothing I do can ever erase that, but I can try to fix what comes next. Give me one chance, Lena, just one, not to be your father. I don't deserve that title, but to take care of you, to make sure you're safe, that you're never hungry or cold again." She studied him for a long time, her small mind working, weighing the sincerity in his voice against the magnitude of his past betrayal. She looked around the luxurious apartment that had become a gilded cage. She looked at the door, at the dangerous freedom that waited beyond it, and she looked at him, the man who was the cause of all her pain and, paradoxically, the only person who seemed to care about her right now. "One chance," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "You get your lie until the ceremony. After that, I decide what to do." She stepped away from the door, walking back to her room, leaving him alone in the hallway. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even a truce. It was an ultimatum, a stay of execution. The days leading up to the ceremony were the most tense of his life. They lived in the same space, but were separated by a chasm of unspoken words and deep hurt. He tried to connect, asking about her drawings, offering her favorite foods. She responded with a cold, distant politeness, fulfilling her end of the bargain with a frightening seriousness. She would be Sophia, the perfect daughter, until the final moment, and then she would be Lena, the judge of his fate. The night of the ceremony arrived. The ballroom of the city's most luxurious hotel was glittering with power and wealth. Arthur, in his impeccable tuxedo, felt like an imposter. Beside him, Lena, in a dark velvet dress, looked like a small princess from a somber fairy tale. She played her part to perfection, smiling at people, answering politely. No one could have guessed the storm raging beneath that serene facade. He saw Marcus across the room, watching them with hawk-like eyes, his private investigator likely at his side. He saw Mr. Blackwood beaming at them, but he noticed Eleanor, beside her husband, her expression grave and watchful. The pressure was immense. Finally, the moment came. Mr. Blackwood took the stage. "And now, I have the honor of announcing the newest senior partner of our firm." Arthur's heart stopped. This was the moment he had worked his entire life for. Arthur Vance. Applause erupted through the hall. Mr. Blackwood beckoned him to the stage. "Come on up, Arthur, and bring your lovely family." Arthur took Lena's hand. It was as cold as ice. As they walked toward the stage, under the full glare of the spotlights, he leaned down and whispered, "It's over, Lena. After this, the lie is over. I promise." They mounted the steps. Mr. Blackwood embraced him, then turned to the microphone. "Arthur is not just a business genius, he's a family man. And to prove it, I'd like to invite his daughter, Sophia, to say a few words about her dad." A microphone was placed in front of Lena. A hush fell over the room. All eyes were on her. Arthur felt the blood drain from his face. This wasn't part of the plan. This was a disaster. This was the end. He looked at Lena, and in her eyes he saw not the frightened girl but the judge. His moment of judgment had arrived in front of his entire world. The silence in the grand ballroom was a living thing, heavy and expectant. Hundreds of pairs of eyes, representing billions in capital and influence, were fixed on the small figure of Lena, standing before a microphone that seemed giant in comparison. For Arthur, standing beside her in the warm stage lights, the entire world had shrunk to this single moment. The buzzing in his ears was so loud he could barely hear his own ragged breathing. He could feel Marcus's gaze, hungry for a scandal, Eleanor's, heavy with knowledge, and Mr. Blackwood's, filled with innocent fatherly expectation. But the only gaze that mattered was Lena's, and she wasn't looking at him. She looked out at the crowd, her large brown eyes scanning the curious smiling faces. Her small hand gripped the base of the microphone, her knuckles white. Arthur desperately wanted to whisper something, to stop her, to protect himself, but he was frozen, a prisoner of the situation he had created. This was her ultimatum. This was the stage where she could wield her power, destroy his lie, and in the process, destroy everything he had built. He braced himself for the impact, for the public humiliation he knew he deserved. Lena cleared her throat, the small sound amplified by the speakers. "Hello," she began, her voice surprisingly clear and steady, without the tremor he expected. "My name is Sophia." A collective sigh of relief escaped Arthur, so quiet only he felt it. She was keeping the deal. She was going to see the charade through. "A lot of you know my dad as a businessman," she continued, her voice gaining confidence. "Someone who understands numbers and stocks and cash flow." She used the term she'd heard him repeat so often, and a soft laugh rippled through the audience. "But I know him a different way." She paused, and the silence returned, thicker this time. "I know him as the man who found me when I was lost," she said, and her words hung in the air, laden with a double meaning that only she, Arthur, and perhaps Eleanor could understand. "He gave me a home when I didn't have one. He gave me food when I was hungry. He kept me safe." Arthur stared at her, stunned. This wasn't the script. This was the truth, a version of the truth, told from a perspective he had never dared to consider. He wasn't just the villain of her story, he was also, in fact, her rescuer. The two realities existed, paradoxically, at the same time. "He's made mistakes," Lena said, and her gaze finally met his. In that brief eye contact, he saw it all, the pain, the anger, the betrayal, but he also saw something else, something new and fragile, a flicker of understanding. A lot of mistakes. Mistakes that hurt people. People he should have loved. The ballroom went deathly quiet. The mention of mistakes in a celebratory speech was shocking. Arthur saw Marcus lean forward in his chair, his face alight with anticipation. Mr. Blackwood looked confused. "But," Lena continued, her voice rising, "the most important thing I've learned from my dad is that a person's worth isn't in the mistakes they made in the past. It's in what they do to fix them. It's in learning and changing and trying to be better." She turned and looked directly at Arthur, speaking now only to him, the crowd forgotten. "He's trying, and that is what makes him a real father to me," she finished. The silence stretched for one extra heartbeat, and then the room erupted in applause. It was an ovation. People, moved by the raw sincerity and unexpected wisdom of this child, were getting to their feet. They didn't see a veiled confession of a sordid past. They saw a story of redemption, of a father and daughter reconnecting. The narrative Lena had crafted, in its simplicity and emotional honesty, was far more powerful than any lie Arthur could have invented. Mr. Blackwood, with tears in his eyes, clapped Arthur on the back. "My boy," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you don't just have a daughter, you have a treasure." Arthur couldn't speak. He just looked at Lena, who was now beside him again, her hand slipping into his. The touch was hesitant, but it was there. Out in the crowd, his gaze met Eleanor's. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod, an expression of reluctant respect on her face. She understood. He had won. The partnership was his. His reputation, far from being destroyed, was stronger than ever. He was the business genius with a heart, the devoted family man. He had gained everything he thought he wanted. But as he looked down at the girl beside him, at the complexity in her eyes and the courage she had shown, he realized a shocking truth. The relief he felt wasn't for the promotion. It was for her hand in his. It was for the fact that, in his greatest moment of judgment, she hadn't destroyed him. She had saved him, and in doing so, she had offered him a gift far more valuable than any partnership or fortune, a glimpse of hope, a chance at a redemption he wasn't sure he deserved or would even know how to honor. The charade was over, but the real and much harder journey was just beginning. The ride home was in a loaded silence, far different from the tense or angry ones they had shared before. It was a silence of emotional exhaustion, of uncertain possibilities. The applause from the ballroom still echoed in Arthur's ears, but it seemed distant, from another world. The only real sound was the soft breathing of Lena beside him in the luxury car. She stared out the window at the city lights streaking by like fallen stars, her face reflected in the glass like a pale ghost. When they reached the apartment, the door closed behind them, sealing them in their private bubble, away from the eyes of the corporate world. Lena pulled the ribbon from her hair, letting the brown strands fall to her shoulders. She turned to him, her expression serious, the girl judge back on her face. "I kept my end of the deal," she said, her voice quiet but unwavering. "The lie is over." Arthur felt a knot form in his throat. He nodded, unable to form words. Everything he had feared and hoped for in the past weeks culminated in this moment, her decision. "What you said on stage," he began, his voice hoarse. "Thank you." "I didn't do it for you," she answered quickly, though without her earlier hostility. "I did it for me. I didn't want the story of my life to be about destroying someone, even if that someone was you." She looked down at her own hands. "My mom, Sunflower, she always said forgiving isn't for the other person, it's for you, so you can stop carrying a weight that isn't yours." The wisdom in her words, inherited from a mother he barely remembered, took his breath away. He, with all his elite education and high-stakes negotiation experience, was being taught about life by a 7-year-old. "Lena," he said, taking a hesitant step toward her, "I know I don't deserve it, but I don't want you to leave. I want the chance to be what you said on stage, the chance to try to be better, the chance to be your dad." She stared at him for a long time, and he felt as though his soul were being weighed and measured. "Being a dad isn't about buying dresses and giving someone a roof," she said, her voice gaining a strength that made him stand still. "Being a dad is about being there. It's about not leaving when things get hard. It's about putting someone else before your money and your business. Do you think you can do that?" The question wasn't rhetorical. It was a direct challenge, the toughest condition he had ever faced. Harder than any merger or acquisition deal. It demanded a complete restructuring of his entire being, a fundamental shift in his values, in everything that had driven him to this point. "Yes," he said, the word coming out with a conviction that surprised him. "Yes. I want to try." She continued to watch him, the decision still hanging in the air. And then his phone rang, the shrill sound shattering the tension. It was Isabella. He glanced at the screen and felt a wave of revulsion. His life before Lena, the life of appearances and status, was calling him. He declined the call. The phone rang again. He declined it again and then turned it off. The gesture did not go unnoticed by Lena. Her eyes registered the action, the choice he had just made. "Tomorrow morning," she said, "finally, I'll give you my answer." And with that, She turned and went to her room, closing the door softly behind her, leaving him alone in the vast, empty living room. A man who had just conquered the peak of his professional world, only to find that his entire future hinged on the verdict of a little girl he had spent most of her life ignoring. The night was agony. He didn't sleep. He sat in the dark living room, staring at her bedroom door, wondering what she was thinking. He reevaluated his life, the decades of blind ambition. The fortune he had amassed, which once seemed like the ultimate goal, now felt like just a pile of paper and numbers. The real treasure was behind that door, deciding if he was worthy. When the morning sun began to paint the sky in shades of grey and pink, the door opened. Lena came out, already dressed in her everyday clothes, not the Sophia dresses. In her hands, she held a sheet of paper. It was one of her drawings. She walked over and held it out to him. Arthur took it with trembling hands. It wasn't of sunflowers. The drawing was simple, almost a sketch. It showed two stick figures, one large and one small, holding hands. Above them was a bright yellow sun, and underneath, in hesitant, childish script, was a single word: beginning. The tears came without warning, a flood of relief, gratitude, and a cleansing pain. He looked up at her, speechless. Lena gave a small, shy smile. "Okay," she whispered. "We can begin." In that moment, as the sunlight flooded the room, Arthur felt a seismic shift within him. The promotion, the partnership, the respect of his peers, it all faded into insignificance. He hadn't just averted a disaster, he had been given a gift, a second chance. The victory last night wasn't securing a new title. The real victory was here, in his hand, on a piece of paper. It was the promise of a new portfolio, one built not with dollars and euros, but with trust, time, and love. It was the greatest investment of his life, and he knew, with absolute certainty, that the returns would be infinite. The beginning was more awkward and difficult than either of them could have imagined. There was no magical transformation, no epiphany that erased the scars of the past. Lena's decision to stay wasn't a pardon, but a probation, and Arthur felt the weight of that scrutiny in every action, every word. The first step, he knew, had to be a complete dismantling of the life he had built. On Monday morning, he walked into his office not as the exultant new senior partner, but as a man on a different mission. He went straight to Mr. Blackwood's office, walking past a confused-looking Marcus in the hallway. He closed the door, and before his boss could offer congratulations, Arthur started talking. He confessed everything, not the sentimental, redemptive version Lena had presented, but the raw, ugly truth. The initial lie, the desperation, the contract with Lena, and the devastating revelation of his paternity and his abandonment of Catherine. Mr. Blackwood listened in silence, his aging face shifting from confusion to disappointment, and finally to a grave, thoughtful expression. When Arthur finished, the silence in the room was heavy. "I understand the consequences," Arthur said, his voice firm. "I'm here to resign from the partnership and, if necessary, from my position at the firm. My only priority now is my daughter." To his surprise, Mr. Blackwood shook his head slowly. "I should fire you, Arthur. What you did was unethical and reprehensible." He paused, looking out the window. "But Eleanor told me about the sunflower shelter, about Catherine, and I saw what your daughter said on that stage. She didn't defend you. She gave you a path forward. Resigning now would be the easy way out. It would be running away. Again." He looked directly at Arthur. "The partnership is on hold indefinitely. You will maintain your current position, under review. Prove it. Prove with actions, not words, that you are the man your daughter believes you can become. That is your new project, and failure is not an option." Arthur left the office feeling strangely light. He hadn't lost everything. He had been given a challenge. Back at his desk, an email from Isabella was waiting. It was short and curt, ending their relationship and accusing him of ruining both their reputations. Oddly, he felt nothing but relief. That door was closed. The next step was legal. He hired the best family law attorneys, not for a battle, but for a process of paternity acknowledgement and formal adoption. He wanted his name on that birth certificate by right and by choice, not just as a ghost from the past. The legal process exposed his story to public scrutiny, creating gossip and scandal. The business media published veiled articles about the executive's family drama. He faced the stares and whispers with his head held high. For the first time, the opinions of others didn't matter. The hardest part, however, happened within the quiet walls of his apartment. He learned how to make breakfast the way Lena liked it. He learned she hated olives and was afraid of thunder. He drove her to and from her new school every day, turning down meetings and important calls. He sat with her as she did her homework, rediscovering simple math and history he had long forgotten. There were setbacks, weeks where she barely spoke to him, retreating into the shell of mistrust that had protected her for so long. One afternoon, she screamed at him that he could never replace her mother, that he would never understand. He didn't argue. He just sat quietly and said, "I know, and I'm not trying to. I just want to be here beside you." The adoption hearing was the climax of this quiet journey. The judge, a stern man, reviewed the case, the history of abandonment, and the recent, sudden paternal interest. It looked bad. The state's attorney recommended a period in a temporary foster home, but then the judge asked Lena if she wanted to say anything. Lena, in a simple dress, stood up. She didn't look at Arthur. She looked at the judge. "He wasn't my dad before," she said, her voice clear in the quiet courtroom. "He was just a man, but for the last few months, he's been learning. He picks me up from school, even when it's raining. He reads to me at night, even when he gets the character voices wrong. He burned dinner last week." A small smile touched her lips. "He's not perfect, but he's here. He didn't leave, and I want to stay with him." The judge's gavel came down. Adoption granted. In that moment, Arthur wasn't a multimillionaire, an executive, or an investment genius. He was a father, legally, officially, and most importantly, in the heart of his daughter. As they walked out of the courthouse, hand in hand, he knew the biggest transaction of his life had just been completed. He had traded a fortune in currency and status for something infinitely more valuable, a family. And he had never felt so rich. 6 weeks. Only 6 weeks had passed since that desperate morning when the city below seemed like a predator poised to devour his ambitions. Now, as he looked out the same panoramic window, Arthur no longer saw a kingdom to be conquered, but a home. The cityscape was no longer a chart of his successes and failures, but the backdrop to a life he never imagined he would have. A life filled not by the echo of his own loneliness, but by the sound of Lena's colored pencils scratching against paper on the coffee table. The apartment, once a minimalist mausoleum of sterile wealth, was transformed. A drawing of 2 stick figures was held by a magnet to the stainless steel refrigerator. A pair of small sneakers, often muddy from the park, sat next to his polished Italian shoes by the door. The glass dining table, once used only for impromptu business meetings, now had a permanent grape juice stain in one corner, an imperfection he considered the most valuable piece of art in his home. He moved away from the window and sat on the rug beside Lena, watching her finish her latest drawing. It was a recreation of the courtroom scene, a grumpy-looking judge, himself looking like a scared giant, and her, small but standing tall, at the center of it all. "I think you made me look braver than I was," he said with a smile. Lena looked at the drawing, then up at him, her expression serious. "You were there, that's brave enough." In those simple words, he found the absolution that no board of directors or judge could ever give him. Her acceptance was the only dividend that truly mattered. His professional life had also found a new equilibrium. He hadn't resigned, but he had delegated. He discovered his team was more capable than he'd given them credit for, that the empire wouldn't crumble if he left at 3 p.m. to watch a school choir performance. He was still good at his job, his market instincts still sharp, but the obsession had been replaced by purpose. Profit was no longer the end goal. It was a means to ensure his daughter's security and future. One day, he took Lena to the sunflower shelter. There, he found Eleanor Blackwood, not as the CEO's wife, but as a volunteer in an apron, serving soup. She saw him and came over. "Arthur," she said, her voice calm, "I'm glad to see you here. I wanted to thank you," he said, "and to make a donation in Catherine's name." He handed her a check. It wasn't a donation to clear his conscience, but an investment in the legacy of the woman who had given him the greatest gift of his life. Eleanor looked at the check, then at Lena, who was clinging shyly to Arthur's hand. "Your mother would be proud." "Lena," Eleanor said softly, "not just of him, but of you." That night, before bed, Lena took off the sunflower locket for the first time. She placed it in her music box. "I don't think I need it to remember anymore," she said. "Now I have you." Arthur felt his heart swell in his chest. He tucked her in, and as he watched her drift off to sleep, he reflected on the extraordinary journey of the past weeks. He had started by seeking a fake daughter to save his career, and had ended up with a real daughter who had saved his soul. He had lost a girlfriend, a promotion, and the flawless image he had prized so highly. But in return, he had gained laughter, awkward hugs, homework help, and the honor of being called Dad. He realized that true wealth wasn't in his assets or his bank account, but in the simple moments, teaching Lena to ride a bike in the park, seeing the joy in her eyes as they adopted a scruffy mutt from a shelter, building family traditions he never knew he wanted. The girl he had found on the street, an actress hired in desperation, had turned out to be the greatest asset of his life. Not because she helped him maintain a lie, but because she forced him to confront the truth. On his desk, where once there had been only stock market charts, there was now a row of framed photos. Lena in the park, Lena with a chocolate-smudged face, Lena smiling at the camera. They were not props to impress colleagues. They were daily reminders that life's greatest victories, the investments with the highest returns, often come disguised as apparent failures, and that sometimes you have to lose everything you think you want to find everything you truly need.